But now I have the honor to speak in this discussion and debate at report stage on Bill C-44, an omnibus budget bill. And it's also very ironic for me because I still am under the impression that with this new Liberal government, the time of omnibus budget bills had ended because we were promised that this new government would not use this tool to throw many measures into one bill.
In this debate, by setting out some of the background around the category of omnibus budget bills, because much has been said and only some of it, in my view, actually captures the problem that we have. It needs to be said that omnibus budget bills were not offensive in a period of time before 2006. You can go back and you can find that between 1994 and 2005, the average budget bill was 73.6 pages long. There is an ironic, I'm using the word irony a lot today, I apologize for that, it just does seem to be the appropriate word. Back in 1994, then leader of the opposition, at that point, not leader, I apologize, the then Reform Party MP and a backbencher, Stephen Harper, in 1994, objected vigorously to the 1994 omnibus budget bill put forward by former Prime Minister, the Right Honourable Jean Chrétien. The Reform MP, as he was then, said, Mr. Speaker, quote, I would argue that the subject matter of the bill is so diverse that a single vote on the content would put members in conflict with their own principles. He went on to say there is a lack of relevancy to these issues. The omnibus bills we have before us attempt to amend several different existing laws. And in the interests of democracy, I ask, how can members represent their constituents on these various areas when they are forced to vote in a block on such legislation and on such concerns, close quote. Now that was referring to the omnibus budget bill of 1994, which was, I would love to ask members here if they could guess how many pages it was, how long it was, but I'm not sure that would be in proper form, Mr. Speaker, to ask members to shout out answers. But I doubt that on a pop quiz any members here assembled would guess it was 24 pages long. Yeah, Stephen Harper was complaining in 1994 about an omnibus budget bill of 24 pages. The longest omnibus budget bill we had had in the history of Canada until Mr. Harper became Prime Minister was Paul Martin, the Right Honourable Paul Martin, as Prime Minister in the spring of 2005, put forward the longest omnibus budget bill in Canadian history to that point. It was 120 pages long. I remember Stephen Harper complaining about it because one of the measures they were going to take in that omnibus budget bill was to amend the Canadian Environmental Protection Act to ensure that greenhouse gases could be regulated under CEPA, and they defended it as a budget measure by saying, well, so much of the budget is our plan to reduce greenhouse gases, so therefore this measure to amend CEPA is all right. In fact, in response to the vigorous criticism from opposition parties, the government of the day backed down and took that section out of the budget bill of 2005. Well, we began to see the use of omnibus budget bills really in a significant way in 2009 and 2010, when the 2009 omnibus bill topped 580 pages, the 2010 omnibus bill topped 883 pages, leading Professor of Political Science, Professor Emeritus of Queen's University, Ned Franks, to write that the use of omnibus budget bills, quote, subvert and evade the normal principle of parliamentary review of legislation, close quote. Now, the use of them in a minority parliament made sense because how else could a governing party that had the minority of the votes force Parliament to accept measures that it would clearly, if given the opportunity, defeat? But since budgetary measures are confidence measures and parties, for one reason or another, didn't want to have an election quite yet, there was always a sort of a propping up of the Conservatives in minority. And the big changes that were made, and they were the first changes to the Navigable Waters Protection Act, there were changes made to the Canadian Environmental Assessment Act, they were pushed through because it was a minority parliament, and putting them in a budget bill was a very clever device. Now, the fact that Stephen Harper continued to use them in majority had a lot to do with the fact that when they had the majority, it moved things through very rapidly and precluded proper study in committee. So we had the double-barreled omnibus budget bills of C-38 and C-45 in 2012 that basically dismantled Canadian environmental law from Fisheries Act to Naval Waters Protection Act, the Canadian Environmental Assessment Act to the National Energy Board Act itself. So what makes omnibus budget bills offensive? It's not solely that there are many bills or many measures all in one bill. The point of an omnibus bill, which is not offensive in and of itself, is that every measure relate to the same purpose or to an overriding theme. There's much, as you would know, Mr. Speaker, that's been written and decreed by speakers, going back to former Speaker Lucien Lamoureux, who was the first to rule on these and say, look, we're moving in a direction, he said back in the 1960s, where a government could say, here's our bill, and it's all the legislative work of an entire session, but it's omnibus. So we have to be careful about omnibus bills. This one has too many measures that shouldn't be in it, although it is a long cry, a far cry from the abuse we saw in the 41st Parliament. But these are the measures that should not have been included in an omnibus budget bill because they are not receiving proper study. One is a change to the Board of Internal Economy. It's very welcome that the Board of Internal Economy meetings will be made public. But back to the position of members of Parliament and parties with fewer than 12 MPs, we are not being given any access to the Board of Internal Economy more than the public would get. In other words, the larger parties can still decide this shouldn't be open to the public and close a meeting of the Board of Internal Economy. But those of us who are members of Parliament don't get any new access to the Board of Internal Economy any more than the public would get. I find that unacceptable. The second area, Mr. Speaker, and I've provided numerous amendments to the sections relating to the parliamentary budget officer in committee. Most of my amendments were defeated. There were government amendments to try to deal with what has become very controversial, that whereas the Liberals promised in the platform, though they promised no more omnibus budget bills either, they described them in the 2015 platform as, quote, undemocratic practice, close quote. But the parliamentary budget officer was promised to be an officer of Parliament and given independence. And many of the sticky ropes put around the parliamentary budget office, particularly in the first draft of this bill at first reading, reduced the independence of the PBO. Some of those have been improved, but not enough. We still have work plans the PBO has to file. They can make changes if situations change, but certainly not the independent officer of Parliament we had expected to see. And I know as my time is running out, I now turn to the Infrastructure Bank. The Canadian Infrastructure Bank, if ever there was a piece of legislation that should have been standalone so it could be properly studied, it's the Canadian Infrastructure Bank. There are assumptions. It still, honestly, given the lack of detail and precision, it still might not be as dangerous as it appears to be in some aspects. But we do know that the Auditor General in Ontario found that using privatization schemes around projects, so-called P3 projects, actually boost the cost. The Ontario Auditor General found an $8 billion increase on the 74 projects they studied. So in my last 10 seconds, Mr. Speaker, I'll merely say that at third reading, Bill C-44 is moving through this place too quickly. It isn't as damaging in omnibus budget bills as ones we saw in the 41st Parliament, but I urge the Liberal government to be far more cautious and set a better standard on such budget bills.
Questions and comments? Questions et commentaires. L'honorable député de... No? The honourable member for Winnipeg North.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I disagree. I'm sympathetic to what the leader of the Green Party is saying. Having said that, I think that in fairness, it's not as much the length as opposed to the content of the legislation itself. And one of the examples the member makes reference to is the infrastructure bank. We've had a great deal of debate about the infrastructure bank. One only needs to look at question period to get a sense of the type of debate that we've been getting, and discussions and so forth, both in committee and inside the House. I would find it very difficult to believe that someone could argue that the infrastructure bank is not a part of the budget. And that's what the budget implementation bill is all about, to implement measures that were presented in the budget, a good budget, I would suggest to you, Mr. Speaker, to implement those things so that Canadians will be able to derive the many, many benefits of this particular bill passing. My specific question to the member is, how would the member ultimately articulate that the infrastructure bank is not a part of the 2017-2018 budget?
The honourable member for Saanich Gulf Islands.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I really appreciate the question, because the reality is that it's not part of a budget as understood by the concept that a parliament controls the public purse is about expenditures. Increasingly, budgets are big, fat pamphlets which declare what a government intends to do. They're almost expansions of election platforms or a thicker version of a speech from the throne. A budgetary measure is one that relates to a tax, a tariff, a subsidy, literal budgetary measures. And the more the budget is used as the big, fat, thick spring brochure, and the less it's actually about the finances of the country, the more we go down this slippery slope where many things are thrown together and pushed too quickly through Parliament.
Questions and comments? The honourable member for Sherwood Park, Fort Saskatchewan.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank my friend for her speech. During the standing orders debate, I had an opportunity to read the Green Party's discussion paper on changes to the standing orders, and I certainly didn't agree with all of it, but I thought it raised some interesting ideas. I guess one of the questions in this discussion is what is meant by an omnibus bill. It's a concept that's actually very different to define, and from the government's perspective, they seem to define a bill as omnibus if it was proposed by a different party, which is obviously an incoherent definition. But I know the Green Party discussion paper says that an omnibus bill is one where members might want to vote for some parts of it but not others. Of course, that's pretty routine in this place, where you might have, even on a bill that deals with a relatively small number of cases. I can think of the issue around supervised consumption sites, where our party strongly agreed with and wanted to expedite some parts of it but disagreed with others. So I wonder if the Green Party leader can kind of develop this idea of what actually is an omnibus bill, how do we identify it and how do we not identify it, because it's not exactly a clear-cut thing.
Honourable member for Saanich Gulf Islands.
And I thank my friend from Sherwood Park, Fort Saskatchewan. It's actually a very great question. Omnibus meaning a lot of things altogether. There was an omnibus bill, for instance, a long one that touched on many pieces of legislation. If you go back in history and look for the piece of legislation that enacted NAFTA. But you can say, even though there were many different pieces of legislation, you might like some but not other bits, the reality is, and this comes from speakers' rulings over the years, it had a unifying theme. It was to the same purpose. Now, of course, that wasn't an omnibus budget bill. That was an omnibus bill changing our legislation to accommodate NAFTA. When you're looking at an omnibus budget bill, I maintain all of the pieces in an omnibus budget bill, to be legitimate, must relate directly to the fiscal aspects of a budget and not to the various things that are announced on budget day to distinguish them. And this question of same theme, unifying theme, one of the pieces that I hope we can pursue, because it was in the government's proposal for changing our rules, was to give the Speaker explicit powers to split apart omnibus bills when they're clearly different pieces of legislation that are not intrinsic to the spending of the Government of Canada.